theme for Women's Week this year is Breaking Boundaries, Reconstructing Activism. And I hope you find inspiration, the kind of inspiration from our presentations and from our sessions all week long that we have had in putting together this week's program. Last night we launched Women's Week with a concert by Tish Hinojosa. Her songs tell stories about the capability of the human spirit to transcend poverty and loneliness and to reach across national borders and among cultures. In her music, it is often the woman who inspires those around her to survive, to flourish, and to dream. We believe that enormous capability of spirit that was so reflected in her music is at the heart of every woman's activism. Every event we have planned this week speaks to us again of the woman's brave spirit. Happily then, Women's Week events will continue through Thursday. Tomorrow at noon in the Gould Auditorium at the Marriott Library, there will be a panel discussion in which women activists from Salt Lake discuss activism in the community, continuity, and change. On Thursday, our second keynote will be Angela Davis, who will, the title of her talk is Feminist Activism, Radical Frameworks for the 21st Century. That will be here at noon in the Open Union Ballroom. There is an exhibit here in the Union Gallery of photographs by Tracy Longley Cook of Utah women activists who have been extraordinary catalysts for change. The opening reception is tomorrow here in the Union Building, main floor from 4 to 6. Please join us for each of these events, and all of them are free of charge. It is now my privilege to introduce the president of the University of Utah, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Bernie Machen is the 13th president of the university, and I think that's a lucky number. As chair of this year's Women's Week Planning Committee, I am very pleased that Bernie will be introducing both of this year's distinguished keynote speakers. President Machen is a visionary and values-centered leader. Among his core values are belief that diversity strengthens any endeavor and that women are equal to any task or challenge confronted by our society. Let me read from his recent address at BYU. Quote, "When I consider the 21st century definition of an educated person, it is essentially gender-free. The roles women can play in this century are unlimited. Access to education is no longer tied to gender, and what makes a person educated has nothing to do with biology." Unquote. A celebration of the accomplishments of women activists would be inappropriate if it were held outside the context of a diverse community and a diverse society. Let me quote President Machen from a later portion of the same speech. Quote, "In order to be a truly educated person in the 21st century, one must embrace diversity and become a citizen of the increasingly global community. We must recognize and accept that there are people with profoundly different ideas and ways of life from our own. We must all learn to live and work with people who see the world through different prisms than our own. And rather than be threatened, we can enrich our lives by celebrating such diversity." What a great statement for the Women's Week celebration for 2001. President Machen, thank you for your principled leadership and for your frequent and public articulation of the values we seek to understand and highlight during the Women's Week celebration. Would you please introduce our speaker?
Thank you, Sarah. I'd also like to thank the Women's Week Committee for their fine work in organizing this week's activities. As Sarah mentioned, boy, I'm so sorry that we're so packed in the back, but we really are. Next thing I expect to see is the fire marshal coming through there. So many of you who can come up close, it'll be harder to get us out of here if we're all packed in together. So if any of you have any room around, raise your hand and let's try to get some of these people distributed. Come on, if you want to, come on up this way. Sit on the, if you don't mind sitting on the floor, we have some space right up. You don't mind. Come on up. Don't be shy. This is worth coming in and sitting down for. I assure you.
Sir, if you could ask everyone trying to push in the wooden chairs. They're all spaced about this far apart. One chair could go down all the aisle.
Okay, we're going to try a community squish, okay? Be kind to your neighbor on, move to the middle of a bit. Okay, let's get started. This is going to be a test of our sense of community tonight, so everybody hang in there. I have the pleasure this evening of introducing Wilma Mankiller, the first woman to serve as Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. We're very happy she could join us on the University of Utah campus, and we certainly welcome her here tonight. Now, first things first, it's about her name. I know that some of you have been wondering about it. I recently read a speech that Ms. Mankiller gave a few years ago at another college. She explained that in the old Cherokee Nation, when they lived in semi-autonomous villages, the person who watched over the village, sort of a sentry or security officer, had the title of Mankiller. Ms. Mankiller's family traces her ancestry to a man who had that title and kept it as his name. However, I'm told that she also has been known to tell people that Mankiller is a nickname and that she has earned it. Born in Oklahoma, Ms. Mankiller moved with her family to California when she was 11 as part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program. In California, she had an awakening to activism. She became involved with the struggle of American Indian activists who occupied Alcatraz Island to dramatize the injustices their people had suffered. She also did volunteer work among Native Americans in California before returning to Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, Ms. Mankiller began work for the Cherokee Nation, initially to recruit young Native Americans for university training in environmental science. She became committed to rural community development and was the founding director of the Cherokee Nation Community Development Department. In 1983, she became the first woman to be elected Deputy Principal Chief. She succeeded the Principal Chief when he resigned in 1985, and then in a historic tribal election in 1987, she became the first woman elected Principal Chief. She was re-elected in 1991 with nearly 83% of the vote. During her tenure as Principal Chief, tribal membership tripled in size, the annual budget doubled, and health services and services to children were greatly expanded. Ms. Mankiller co-authored the book Mankiller, A Chief and Her People, and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom and induction into the National Women's Hall of Fame. We are all honored tonight to have Ms. Mankiller with us. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. My mother and I and my nieces who are here. Do you want to stand up, Adrian, Deanna? I have two of my nieces that came here. We went out today. The weather was beautiful, and we went out today and looked at the mountains, and I always like being in a place that is the homeland of Native people. And while a lot of people visit Salt Lake City, and there are a lot of beautiful things there, we went to the Temple Square and saw the other tourist attractions. I was fascinated by just sitting and thinking about the people who used to live here, the Utes and the Shoshone, the Paiutes, the Goshutes, and to try to remember that many of those people, those tribal people, sang their songs, and probably in this very place where we're standing here, and held their ceremonies and told their stories and lived their lives, and probably some of them are buried near here in this land now called Salt Lake City. So it was a very beautiful day we had here, and a time to reflect on the original people of this land. My topic tonight is dancing on the edge of the roof, and which to me seems like what I've done most of my life. And rather than a formal lecture tonight, I'm going to talk to you in a very conversational way about what I know about leadership, and talk to you about how I evolved from a very young woman with little self-confidence, others having little self-confidence in me, to a woman who would one day stand up to a group of people and ask thousands of my own people to follow me, and tell them very confidently that I thought that I could lead. I'd like to talk to you about that evolution a little bit. But before that, I want to talk to you, because I have the opportunity to do so, just for a couple of minutes about history. And the reason that I want to do that is because there's so little accurate information about Native American people in the general public that it's impossible to put my life and my work in any kind of context, because you don't have the background information to do that. And so I'm just going to try to answer a single question that I'm asked very frequently, and that is, why do tribal governments exist today? And along with that, there's a sub-question that's a part of that question, which is, why do your people continue to have the worst social indicators of decline of any group in this country? How did that come to pass? I can't answer all those questions in 5 to 7 minutes that I want to speak to you about history, but I want to give you a background and an idea of some of the historical factors that played a part in where we are today and why we deal with the problems that we have today. When the United States first began dealing with Native people, they dealt with them on a government-to-government basis. For those of you who've studied Lewis and Clark and had an opportunity to look at replications of their original notes, you'll note that when they encountered Native people, they referred to them as members of nations, not as individual tribal people, but as members of nations. And among my people, the Cherokee, before we had a treaty with one of the colonies, and I think our first treaty with one of the colonies was with South Carolina, we had a treaty with Britain, which was a peace and friendship treaty. And we styled ourselves then the Cherokee Nation. And so people who've just heard about tribal governments in the last 3 decades or so in the newspapers, and what they hear about is issues of taxation, or some tribes are now into gaming, or law enforcement issues, or whatever, people begin to wonder, how did it come to pass that in one of the most powerful countries in the world, we have these little tiny governments that have sovereign authority? And what I wanted to share with you is that's always been the case. Long before there was a United States government or a constitution, the people here on this land, now called America, had constitutions. The Constitution may not look like the Constitution that you're accustomed to seeing, the United States Constitution. Some of our constitutions, for example, were on a wampum belt. The color and the arrangement of the beads represented policies and ways in which people were to live their lives, and commemorated important events. Before Columbus arrived, there was a United Nations among the Iroquois, where the tribes had been warring, and they decided to come together for the purpose of peace and trade. And so they formed what is called the Iroquois Confederacy, which still exists today, is in existence today. And most people don't realize that. They think that you go to your third grade class, and what you learn in the third grade is that Columbus discovered a new world here. And then history begins with the arrival of Columbus, with no reference or discussion of the people that had lived here for thousands of years, and for whom this certainly was not a new world. It was a very old world, as I said earlier, where people live their lives and have a very close tie to the land. After the treaty era, and for the historians I'm going to skip a lot of history here, after this initial treaty era and treaty-making era, we entered the war era. And despite what you may have read about and seen on films and learned from the popular culture, the war era was really about an ever-expanding population and tribal people trying to hold on to their homelands. What Americans, everyday Americans who aren't interested in Native American history don't hear about is they don't hear about the massacres, the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne, or other situations where entire villages of people were almost completely wiped out. Instead, the image that everyday Americans have is a bloodthirsty Native American people bothering these poor innocent settlers. And the story is much more complex than that. After the war era, we entered what I call the reservation and relocation era. And what I'd like to touch on just briefly is the story of my own tribe, the Cherokee. Our people lived in the southeast, in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, that whole area. Had lived there for thousands of years. And what happened is that in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, states began to develop, grow up around the old Cherokee Nation, Georgia and other states, and then they began to bitterly resent having a separate sovereign entity, the Cherokee Nation, within the boundaries of these new states. So they began pushing the U.S. government to abolish Cherokee tribal government or remove Cherokee people. There were also other factors that played a part in the push to move us out of our homeland. One is plain old greed. Another one was racism. People wanted to move us away from the other population, our new southern neighbors. And our land, some of our land was good land for growing cotton and good land for growing tobacco. A little gold had been discovered in our homelands as well. So a lot of factors that were causing people to want us moved. And in 1839, or 1838 and 1839, if you can imagine, our entire people, all the Cherokee people, were forcibly removed by the United States government. It's not a long time ago in history, if you really think about it. And the federal government sent out the United States Army troops to our homes, and they confiscated our homes and our land, and sent us to Indian Territory, which was a repository for tribes whose land had been removed. The Cherokees weren't the only people that were moved to Indian Territory. There were many other tribes there that were moved there from other places, some places as distant as New York State. And so what the United States government promised us at that time was that we would be left alone once we were in Indian Territory forever. That once we were in Indian Territory, we could reestablish our government and begin to rebuild again as a people, and that we could live our lives uninterrupted forever. We gave up a lot during that removal. Fully 1/4 of our entire tribe died, either while they were being held in stockades throughout the southeast or on the removal itself. We gave up a lot of lives. We gave up a lot of land in the southeast for the land that we were given in Indian Territory. Anyway, history has a terrible way sometimes of repeating itself. And at the turn of the 20th century, through a series of acts that I won't go into, our tribal lands in Indian Territory were once again broken up. The land we had always held in common in our original homeland and in Indian Territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma, were divided up into individual allotments of 160 acres per family. And so our schools were closed. Our tribal council no longer could meet. Our court system was closed. And so we really had no one to protect us from that period of around 1906 when Oklahoma came into being, and we revitalized our tribal government in the late 60s and the early 70s. And so I give you that background information so that you can see the change and the removal and the social interruption that happened to our people. That's a backdrop for who we are. And if you can imagine leaving everything you've ever known, your political system, your cultural system, your family network, your land, everything you've ever known, and being moved to a strange place, and with many family members lost or dead, and trying to start all over again. That's what happened to our people. Yet what was remarkable, I think, about Cherokee people then, and about Native American people in general, is that, and our story is not dissimilar to the story of many other tribes as well, is that our people began to almost immediately rebuild a government and rebuild themselves as a people. And we had some of the first schools west of the Mississippi, for example. And interestingly, we had schools for the education of women, which was a radical idea for that part of the world at that particular period of time. We printed our own newspapers in Cherokee and English. And while there were still people in this country, not many, but a few people debating whether or not Native American people had souls or were human, we were running our own school system where we were teaching botany, Latin, and many, many other courses in both Cherokee and in English. And so that's the backdrop for our life and work. We've had the most powerful country in the world from the outset never learn anything about us at all. We have had to learn everything about them. And so we've lived within that culture. We go to the larger society's schools. We go to their churches. We watch their films. We live with their popular culture. We know everything about them. We have to. They know nothing about us even now. They didn't then, and they know very little about us as a people now, either our history or our contemporary life or our contemporary issues. What they've done, because they didn't know us, and we were kind of the other over there, and we have been referred to in many historical documents as the Indian problem. What they've done is instituted a set of policies from the outset that were designed to make sure that in the year 2001 we no longer existed as tribal people, and policies designed to destroy our culture, to take away our language, to take away our land. And so it's an absolute miracle to me to see that here in the 21st century, that here we still stand as a culturally distinct group of people, despite everything. And no one could have predicted that, I think, 100 years ago. And people always describe me as an optimist. How could I not be an optimist when I see what we've been through before and survived? We will survive anything as we move forward into the 21st century. Even in the most troubled tribal community in this country, the most troubled tribal community, there are still people there that they're trying to look into tribal traditional knowledge and trying to learn traditional life ways as a way of sustaining them, life ways that have sustained them since the beginning of time to now, and that will help sustain them into the future. And so it was in a community, a Cherokee community in 1945, that had that sort of philosophy of not being angry about the past and not lamenting the present, but sort of looking toward the future, that I was born. And so it's some tribal people, some of the people called this concept, it's an actual concept and a life way and a way of thinking, having a good mind, being of good mind, or being able to find something positive about the life situation you find yourself in, or when you meet people and greet them, trying to find something positive about the people you meet rather than focusing on their negative attributes. And I saw a lot of that growing up. I'm one of 11 children. We had no indoor plumbing. We had no electricity. We had no paved road near our house. And some people, look at my childhood and say we were poor. But for me, it was an incredibly rich childhood because we spent most of our time in the natural world, in nature outside. And we also were able to, I also was able to learn a lot about community that has sustained me through today. And I saw people who bartered to help each other out. If somebody grew a crop and somebody else had eggs, or somebody had milk and somebody else had something, they traded to kind of sustain each other in a community. People helped each other out, always helped each other out. And the other thing I learned by watching people in my community is that they always had something good to say. You could talk to somebody who was in a bedfast situation and very, very ill, or somebody was down on their luck that had very little money or something, and they always had something good to say. They'd say, yeah, but it's a beautiful day. Or if it was an older woman, she might say, yeah, but I can still quilt. I may not be able to walk, but I can still quilt, or whatever. They always found something good to say about the situation they found themselves in. So in this continuation of policies that the government developed to try to break up tribal people, in the late 50s they had in the 60s, after World War II, they developed a Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program. And the idea was to take Native people and move them from their homelands to distant cities and assimilate them into the larger population to break up their tie to the land and the tie to the people. And they did that to thousands and thousands of families, and my family participated in that program. And so we left our very insulated Cherokee community in eastern Oklahoma, a very rural area. We'd never been anywhere. I remember a girl in school, when I told her I was going to go to California, we were going to go to California on relocation, and she said, where is that? And I said, I think it's over by Muskogee, because I knew that there was a Muskogee Fair, because the older kids talked about the Muskogee Fair. I had no concept of what urban life might be like. And so anyway, so our family, we got on a train and ended up in San Francisco, and like many other government promises, their promise of a better life for us ended up being a very rough housing project in San Francisco. And so we eventually grew up there, spent a lot of time there, and returned home. But it was in San Francisco that I learned the seed for my ultimately moving to a leadership was born. I started doing volunteer work at the Indian Center, which was kind of a oasis in this whole city. We tried to find people who were similar to us in some ways, so we found the San Francisco Indian Center, and later my whole family got involved in the occupation of Alcatraz Island. My brothers and sisters lived there. These girls' mom lived there until the very last day when the marshals removed them. And so we were always continuing what we'd learned at home, which was helping people and being active in the community and being involved and engaged in the world around us. And what was interesting is during that time when I started doing volunteer work, I was still a teenager. And there was a woman, a Klamath woman, who worked at the Indian Center named Justine Buckskin, who saw potential in me and the other young people who volunteered there that other people did not see. They just saw rough edges. They saw street kids from the housing projects, Indian kids from the housing projects. They did not see potential. And so I guess one of the messages I wanted to give you is don't ever assume that because someone's living in certain circumstances that they don't have tremendous potential. Anyone looking at me and all my brothers and sisters when we were living in Oklahoma with no amenities, or living in a housing project in San Francisco, would have ever thought any of us would even survive to adulthood, probably, much less be involved in all the things that not only I but my family members were involved in. Anyway, because of where we lived, we started helping out and looking around us and being drawn to people who were doing things. And the very first group that I actually saw doing volunteer work was a group that you probably heard very terrible things about, the Black Panther Party. And they were the Black Panther Party that I saw in my community in the housing project is not the one that I see on the news. These folks were helping kids get to school. They provided a free breakfast program. They took senior citizens to the doctor and different things like that. Later it evolved into an entirely different organization, but that was one of the first groups that I saw. The second group of activists that I saw were the women at the San Francisco Indian Center, and particularly this Justine Buckskin, who took all the young people under her wing and tried to help them. I began, as I moved into young adulthood, I continued to volunteer. During Alcatraz, I did fundraising and that sort of thing, and then afterwards I volunteered for the Pitt River Tribe for 4 years, put together a legal defense fund and did the other things that the tribe wanted me to do. But I was always in the background. If you ever run into people who knew me during that period of time, when I was in the Bay Area or during Alcatraz, and you ask, what was Wilma like? They'll say she was quiet. I was quiet. I was the person who always made the coffee. I was the person who made the copies. I was the person who set up the press conferences. I wrote the speeches for the men, which enabled me to tell them what to say. But anyway, I was always in the background somewhere in a supportive role. And at meetings, I never spoke up. I still didn't have the self-confidence to speak up. And I remember one time when I was in Oakland, we were working on some community project, and there was a big controversy about something. And I think that really and truly the first time one of the riskiest things I've ever done, and I've done a lot of risky things, was probably speaking up the first time at a meeting and totally disagreeing with everything that was going on in the meeting. Before that, I'd leave the meetings and I'd think I had ideas about how to do that, or sometimes I thought my ideas would have worked a little better than what people were talking about, but I didn't dare say anything. And when I finally stood up and challenged everybody in the meeting, and I cared about the issue more than I cared about what was going on with myself, it seems like for me in my mind, I crossed some kind of line and I never went back. And during about the same time that I did that was the early start of the women's movement. And the women's movement had a profound impact on everybody, no matter where they live. And for me, what I saw images of women doing things they hadn't done before and saying things that they hadn't said before, and women in leadership roles. I remember one time being at the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland and watching a film of a woman leader who stood up and spoke about treaty rights. She wasn't making copies. She wasn't writing speeches. She wasn't doing the background work. She was leading the effort. And so all that had an impact on me. In the in the late 70s, I decided, just the way I do things, decided it was time to go home. I was divorced and had 2 children, had no money. I borrowed the money to rent a U-Haul to go from San Francisco to Oklahoma. I just knew it was time to go home. I'd been doing lots of volunteer work, and I was directing a youth center at the time, a Native American drop-in center. I just decided it was time to go home. And so I remember I went to my friend Lou Trudell's house, and Lou and John and I forgot somebody else was there, and it was crazy the way our logic, but anyway, they packed sandwiches and lunches and that sort of thing in a cooler, and off we went in our U-Haul across the country. Well, we made it to Salt Lake City, and my sister lived in Salt Lake City, so I borrowed enough money from her to get to Denver. And then I got to Denver, and then I called somebody else and borrowed enough money to get to Oklahoma. And when I arrived in Oklahoma, I had $20. No car, no job, but I knew that it was time to go home. I had a lot of skills, and I knew things would be okay, but I knew it was time to go home. And so I got a job fairly quickly with the Cherokee Nation, a low-level management job. And when I began working there were no women executives. There'd never been a female principal chief, never been a female deputy chief. And I didn't begin working there with the idea that I would someday lead the Cherokee Nation. I began working there with an absolute faith in our people's capacity to do do things for ourselves, to articulate our own vision of the future, and to work toward meeting our own goals, and to do things for ourselves. We just needed a little facilitation and a few resources. And so, believing that, I began developing programs. And developing programs translates into bringing in revenue. And as I began to bring in revenue, I caught the attention of the bureaucracy, and I began to move up, so that eventually I became the founding director of the Cherokee Nation Community Development Department. It was interesting because everybody around me, when I began doing projects in community development, I would go to rural bilingual Cherokee communities, and they would have very basic needs like water, housing, a youth center, those kinds of things. And I would propose that they build the water line themselves, and that they build the houses themselves. And people in town and people who didn't believe in our people would say to me, well, those people don't even work for a living, you know, much less as a volunteer to do these things for themselves. And I quickly pointed out to them that they don't work for a living because there's no place to work around there. There are no jobs. And so I believed then that given the right set of circumstances, our people would go back into their tradition of helping each other. If you did an entire community project, that I could motivate people to do something for the common good. So I banked everything on that belief, everything. I put together the funding and went to several communities, and we developed projects what caused the people to come together in a partnership, the entire community. If somebody wasn't able to do something, then they had to designate a member of their family or a friend to represent them, so that everybody was represented. They elected their own local leadership, and they did indeed do exactly what I thought they would do. And I remember the first day driving up, we were starting a big water line project, and we were doing it with self-help. And I remember, and all these people had told me I shouldn't even be in this one community where after dark by myself, and I saw a totally different community of loving people who had good traditions, who helped each other. They still hunt there, and they would share things when they hunt or fish, help each other if they were in some kind of problem. That's what I saw. I didn't see what these other people saw. Anyway, so I'm going out to the first day of the project, and for just a second, as I started to turn the corner where they were starting the water line, I just kind of held my breath. And because I had banked everything I ever believed on the fact that our people, just as they had after the Trail of Tears, just as other Native people have throughout this country, that we would rise to the occasion, and that we would get up and go again. And sure enough, when I came around the corner, there were all the volunteers ready to go. And so they built a 16-mile water line themselves, rehabbed some houses, and then we'd replicated that again and again and again. So that was my initial work at the Cherokee Nation. In 1983, the then principal chief asked me if I would run with him for the position of deputy principal chief, and I declined. My work had always been as a community activist and as a volunteer, and I couldn't, and our tribe's a really big tribe. Now there are 210,000 enrolled members, and then there were many, I don't remember the exact number, but there were many thousands of enrolled members. So running for election in our tribe is like it's like a mainstream election with radio advertisements, sometimes television and billboards and all that, and I couldn't imagine myself making the transition. And so I declined. And then I went to a community, a rural community, one day, and I went down a road I hadn't been down before, and there was a family, I'll never forget this, living in a car, and right next to it there was another family living in a bus. And what was so poignant about that is that they were there for a while, because they had built clotheslines and had clotheslines out on the line. And one of the things that I did in the community development department is that I built houses and built water lines, and I knew construction. And so I thought that if I could do something to help those people and reallocate resources of the Cherokee Nation, I would do that. And so I drove straight that day from that community back to tell the principal chief that I would indeed run for election. So again, just as many, many years before, when I spoke up at my first meeting I was motivated more by the larger issue than I was about any lack of self-confidence. In this particular issue, I was motivated more by what I could do than I was about my own reticence about getting involved in tribal politics. Tribal politics, by the way, is much more brutal than mainstream politics, and so running for Congress would be a piece of cake after that, after being in tribal politics. But anyway, so it was interesting in 1983 because I'd had this kind of interesting political background, and where we are is in a very conservative part of Oklahoma. I thought the big issue would be my political background in the 1983 election, and it wasn't. The big issue was my being a woman. And it was interesting is that it had never occurred to me that that would be an issue. And one thing I can say about my mother and my father is that they never told us that there were things that we couldn't do because I'm a woman, or because we were poor, or because we were Cherokee. Never even entered my mind. Never occurred to me that I couldn't do that. And yet here were these people arguing that our tribe would be the laughing stock of all the tribes if we ended up with a woman in the number 2 position in 1983. And it was very hurtful to go to a meeting and have people get up and say things to me that were very demeaning, just because I'm female, not about issues, but because I'm a woman. I remember one time during the height of all the controversy about my being a female, trying to attain this position, I called a friend who was on the board of the Ms. Foundation for Women, and she's very witty, and I called her to see if she could tell me some witty things I could say to people when they came up and said hurtful things to me, instead of just standing there and looking at them. And so anyway, she told me, well, I can't repeat what she actually told me, but it would have worked. It would have worked very well. But anyway, she gave me some advice, and her advice was that I should stay focused on the issues and not allow my energy to be siphoned off into nonsensical arguments about whether or not women should be in leadership positions. And I thought it was excellent advice. And during that same time, I saw a little saying on the back of a tea box that said, "Don't ever argue with a fool, because someone walking by and observing you won't be able to tell which one is the fool." And I thought if I got involved in these foolish arguments about whether or not women should be in leadership, that would be the case. So I stayed focused on the issues and continued on. One more story in that election. It was such an interesting election. I had to be an optimist to get through this. I had a political event. And remember, we have thousands of members. I didn't know anything about politics. The chiefs that I was running with, people weren't crazy about me. And because he's a moderate Republican and I'm a liberal Democrat, extreme liberal Democrat, and so his people were trying to get him elected and hoping somebody else would get elected, and so I was kind of out there by myself, and I decided to have a political event. So I had it in this historical house in Tahlequah. There's a lot of Cherokee history involved. I invited Grace Thorpe, Jim Thorpe's daughter, who's a friend, and invited her down, and we put it on the radio and that sort of thing. And we had we catered it, and 5 people showed up. And 3 of them were related to me. So I figured, okay, here's the deal. It can't get any worse than this. So I need to just stay focused and move forward. And I was elected in 1983, just barely. I think I won by something like 2 or 3% of the vote. And then when our chief resigned in 1985, I'd gone through such a rough election in 1983, I thought I was going to have to go through this all over again. I remember during that time, right after he left, a group of older people in a small community had a reception for me because I was becoming the new chief. And I walked in the door, and I was so used to, having people argue with me and that sort of thing, that when I walked in and all these older people stood up and started clapping, I honest to God thought there was somebody behind me. I really did. I kept thinking Congressman Steiner had come in or something. And but I I saw that there was had been a little difference between 1983 and 1985. Then I ran in 1987 again and won fairly well, and then won in 1983 and won extremely well. And so the evolution, I guess, of my leadership, I think was that I cared about the issues. And I guess that particularly for young people, if I have any message to you about all that, it's that I don't think a life is worth living unless you're engaged in the community around you and the world around you, and if you're not willing to step up and do something. Too many people in this country are always talking about they should solve the environmental problem. They should solve the problems with violence in society. They should solve the problems with violence against women. Whatever the issue is, it's always they. They should do something. Well, who is they? Who is that group? Is there some group out there that I don't know about? All I know for me is that there's only us. There's you and me. And I don't think that any great prophet or great leader is going to come and save us or lead us. I think that change comes from communities and from people like you and from people like me and from people stepping up and doing things ourselves. It's interesting during presidential elections to see the amount of attention that's focused on the presidents. And yet very, very few presidents have ever been able to articulate a clear vision for this country that represents all of us and includes all of us and that could help us move forward. That happens at the community level. And so I think that I'd like to encourage people to really get involved in issues around you and not be afraid to step up and lead. Sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes if you are dancing on the edge of the roof, you fall off. The view's a lot better up there, by the way. And you just get up and go back and continue on. And so not everything that I've ever tried has worked. But it's very important to stay engaged. The things that I've learned about leadership, and I only know leadership from a woman's perspective, that help me are, one is that no one wants to follow somebody who's negative. I think that people have to have a positive attitude and to mean it, and to have a lot of faith, hope, and optimism about the future. You have to project that to people and give them some reason for hope and to follow your ideas and to partner with you in whatever you're doing. So I think the very first attribute of leadership that's critical is having a positive attitude and showing people respect, even people you totally disagree with, and or you have total political disagreements with, to acknowledge them as human beings and to show them respect and to listen to them respectfully. And sometimes they'll even move your position a little, or you'll move their position a little, but not to close off people simply because you disagree with them politically. And I think the second attribute of leadership that's very critical is having a sense of collaboration. No one person can make unilateral decisions and charge ahead. I think women are more acculturated, by and large, to see things in a more interconnected way and to build teams and to lead in a collaborative way. And many men, not all, but many men are acculturated to make unilateral decisions and move ahead. And we're not taught to think that way. We're taught to focus on everything. I think for women, context is everything. For example, if you talk to a woman leader about preparation for higher education, she might tell you that preparation for higher education doesn't begin in high school. It begins with a good Head Start program, or maybe even good prenatal care. If you talk to a woman about economic development, she won't talk to you just about developing a business in isolation, but about also developing job training programs, having adequate health care, having adequate daycare. And it's a larger context, a more interconnected way of doing things. I don't have any scientific basis for my assertion that women's leadership, by and large, is very different, but I just know from my own experience and from dealing with other people. I think leaders tend to see barriers not as reasons to give up, but as challenges. And for young people that are students who run into some big barrier, I think if you can see that as a challenge to your intellectual ability and your maturity, emotional maturity, to figure out, okay, here's the barrier. I'm not going to use that as a reason to give up. I'm going to find a way to, if I can't get over the barrier, I'm going to go around it, I'm going to go under it, I'm going to get by it. And I think that's an extremely important attribute of leadership. Good leaders never, ever, ever give up. Never give up, no matter what's going on. I think those are very, very important. I want to save some time here for some questions. I just want to make a couple of more points here about women. Because there's so little accurate information about Native American people in society, the vacuum is filled with nonsensical stereotypes. And I've been interviewing Native American women around the country for a book I'm working on, and I've been stunned by some of the things that I've discovered, that where even today there are ridiculous stereotypes about Native people. And I can remember my own experience when I was principal chief. Two things happened that come to mind. One is that a reporter from New York, had a very crisp English accent, called me for an interview and asked me if I rode a horse to work. And then he asked me some other similar question, and I thought, okay, I'm going to take this guy for a ride. So I told him that Charlie and I lived in a teepee along the edge of a river, and that he caught fish and all that. And then finally I corrected all that and gave him the correct story. That was one incident. And then the other one was that I was at a mental health conference in Ohio, and a reporter from, I think, the Cincinnati Enquirer sat down by me and said to me during the conference, do Native Americans have mental health problems? Okay, Native Americans are human. And so she was operating from the viewpoint that Native people weren't even human or something, or that they were so other, another species. She had to ask the question of whether Native Americans had mental health problems. And so anyway, there's a lot of very pervasive stereotypes about there, and they're even worse about women. In our culture, in American culture, Native American women are either innocent children of nature, romping through the woods, selling Mazola margarine, or we're drudges who are always washing the clothes down by the creek, or doing those kinds of things. And Native American women have to live with that kind of stereotype. In truth, it's much more complex than that. Among our people, Cherokee people, when I became elected, my election was a step forward for women, and also forward into our tribal culture, our historic tribal culture. Women held a very significant role among the Cherokee people historically. And there was a women's council. There was a very strong woman who was called a pretty woman, who was like a warrior woman. And women were responsible for helping keep balance in the community and in the society. And women had a say in the family and the community. When men and women married, the man went to the woman's property. And so it was only after we began to be assimilated into the larger culture that women slowly, over a long period of time, began to assume a secondary role. So that by 1983, when I ran for election, my own people were saying, how dare a woman try to be in a leadership role. And among the Iroquois people, for example, I interviewed a woman recently, an Onondaga clan mother. And if for outsiders who would look at the Onondaga, they would see only male chiefs and assume that that was a patrilineal society. Nothing could be further from the truth. The women, the clan mothers, the women there select the chiefs, and they can take them down if they don't act appropriately. There's a beautiful ceremony they go through where I think they put elk horns on when they install them as chiefs, and when they take them down, they call them dehorning them. I kind of like that. Anyway. But the point is that they have control over that. But outside people looking at that, they may have a different view of that. So there's a lot, I think, society has to learn about Native people. There's also a pervasive view that every tribe now has a gaming casino and gets a check every month. And that's certainly not true. And there are some tribes that are in casinos and some tribes that are not in casinos. So let me close by saying that I don't know why anybody in the world would want to live a life of moderation. I can't. It's beyond me. This is life, and it's an incredible, unbelievable gift given to us by the Creator. And I can't understand why people would want to live a life of moderation. I think we should love fully. We should, if we've been given talents, whether it's art or the ability to put together a project or to teach or whatever, to make music, whatever our gift is. Maybe it's to be a carpenter. Whatever our gift is, to share that with people, to get engaged in the world around you. I think we should love fully and completely and not be afraid to talk about love and help each other and be engaged in the world around us and not be afraid to explore our own spirituality and the spirituality of people around us. And I hope my being here and spending a little time with you will help you to eliminate any stereotypes you might have about what a chief looks like. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a hearing problem, so if I'm going to do questions, somebody has to come help me. Okay.
Do you have a question? Anyone have a question that you'd like to ask? Yes. Could you stand up?
When you're out in the other tribes giving talks, do you find that a lot of the older male generation find it offensive that you call yourself a chief?
You know, it's quite the contrary. When no matter where I go among tribal people, the older people are enormously respectful to me. Even if women haven't advanced in their tribe yet, they're always real respectful to me. And in my 1983 election, it was the older people who were my biggest supporters. And we could never really figure that out at the time because I thought the young professionals would support me. And they were used to male leadership and they weren't as comfortable. But later we figured out it was because the older people were a little closer to a time when there was more balance between men and women. So no matter where I go, next week I'm going to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, not to do a talk, but to help the new president there, who's a woman, get her work done. And the people there, the last time I was there, the older people brought out the drum and, were really, really, really respectful to me.
The question was, when you're visiting other tribes, are the people there respectful or disrespectful? Another question?
I'm from Japan. I'm very interested in the school system in your tribe. When the child must have to take the school, and until when students end the school in your tribe, and is there some characteristic education program compared to American government?
We have to ask you to repeat the question. I'm sorry, we couldn't hear you.
Okay.
You want to come up a little closer?
Come up a little closer so we can hear you.
I'm from Japan, and I'm from Japanese Education Administration. I'm interested in the school system in your tribe. The children have to start to take the education and until when students must take the class. And is there some characteristic education program compared to American government?
Mm-hmm.
The question is about whether or not the Cherokee school systems has a unique school system and a comparison between the American school system and the Cherokee system.
They don't now. We did in the period after the Cherokee removal from the 1840s on. We had an extensive school system then, and in fact, it's often been said that we were more literate than our non-Indian neighbors in Arkansas and Texas. I still think we are, but anyway. It's only been about 25 years since we revitalized the Cherokee Nation, and we only operate one school now, and it's a high school, which is an OBI boarding school, and that compares. It's about the same as the regular school system, but I think over time it will be far superior.
Someone over here.
You talked about the little information available and commonly discussed in popular American culture about various Native Americans and specifically the Cherokee. I was wondering if you would maybe discuss some ways of restoring, or some ways that you might see of restoring that balance of which we can come to an understanding of the various tribes.
I think two things. I think that non-Native people who have good hearts and good minds, who are interested in Native American issues, should learn all they can about Native American people and then educate the people around them. I think that's really important. And then I also think that Native people themselves need to produce more films and more books and more articles. And I was at a Native American Writers Conference, and one of the writers made up what I thought was really a good point, and that's that he would like to see a film someday that where a Native American person is not an icon or anything like that, but is someone who's going to pay their light bill or something, and so that it's just a story about the human struggles of people, of everyday Native American people. I think feature articles in the major papers would make a huge difference, and not just about issues and not just about leaders, but just human interest stories about children and families and aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas and that sort of thing. So, and we're beginning to see a little bit of that with the Sherman Alexie's film and some of the other films that have been produced in the last few years. A lot of very talented young people, I think, will help.
Okay, I don't know how many
Could you stand up?
I don't know how many people this applies to, but as far as for myself, I'm 1/16th Cherokee, and I've been in the South my whole life and haven't been able to connect with the tribe or the traditions, and I'm wondering how one could go about doing that.
His question is, he's 1/16th Cherokee, and he would like to know how a person who's been separated from the tribe all his life can become connected with the tribe.
That's a really tough question, because I think that there are Cherokee people who, I don't know how to describe it, would be tribal Cherokee people, and then Cherokee people who are legal members. And so trying to figure out how to make traditional knowledge available to the people who, through no fault of their own, don't have access to it is a very difficult question. And I think that one of the truest and the best ways, actually, I could give you a pat easy answer, but there is no pat easy answer. I think that the only way that could happen is for you to come home and spend time among the people, either in summers or on breaks or in some way of being around people, being around the people. Otherwise, it's all intellectual, and it's all theoretical, and it looks good on you can read wonderful things, but until you feel it and live it and talk with people and interact with people, it's hard to be part of a of the culture in that way. So that's what I would recommend, is try to connect with people at home.
What's your plan?
His question is, what's your clan?
What's my clan? I can't tell you that publicly, because at home they believe you that people who make bad medicine can use that. If they can't use that unless they have your clan. Yeah.
Did you hear that?
What?
He asks your age.
Oh, my age. I'm happy to tell you that. I'm 55. Yeah.
One more question over here. Okay, stand up. And you, okay.
I'm mixed blood, and being such, I know you're also mixed blood. I'm wondering if that's caused you problems down the line, especially in your role.
The question is that she's mixed blood, and she knows that you are mixed blood, and she wants to know if that has caused you problems in your life.
Never. I'm half Cherokee, and my father spoke Cherokee, and he was the dominant figure in our family and our life, and so I never even really realized that I was mixed blood. I never thought like that. I've always been Cherokee, and my mother was married to my dad when she was 15, and her family ostracized her, and so even when my mom was like in her 60s, she went to a Choctaw funeral, and it was before I was well known, and they asked her, Mankiller, is that a Cherokee name? And she said, yeah, I'm Cherokee. And then she went, oh, no, I'm not. And because she became so much a part of the Cherokee culture. So people who say they have had difficulty or anything, I've never. I was born Cherokee, I was raised Cherokee, and that's who I am.
Okay, one more. Okay.
I'm speaking as a parent, and I'm wondering what kind of advice or support would you give to me as a parent, because I'm the mother of 2 Indian boys, and I would like to raise them to be warriors, because it seems like in today's society we are losing our warriors in our native country, and women are taking the lead. How can I raise them to be resilient and to be warriors again?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the women that I interviewed, the strongest, most forward-thinking women, all tribal women to a person, spoke about the need for balance, for there to be balance in society, balance between men and women. All they want is for women to have everything that they deserve, but they want men to have that as well. If you define warriors as people who take care of people and who have a good heart and who will protect people and watch out for people, then I think that's something that's very needed. To me, you look at the shooting that happened in California this week and all the things that are happening in the larger society. It's like they've lost their rudder, and they don't have those kind of important values of helping each other and protecting the children and respecting one another and acknowledging one another. And I think if you can instill that in them so that they can not pay attention to all these other wild things that are going on in society, that would be the most important thing. To me, if they're raised within what I've seen as I've traveled the country, traditional tribal knowledge systems, that they're okay, the men and the women, that they're able to withstand all the enormous pressure. Women that I've met have had pressure from society to be only concerned about how they look, or that sort of thing, or to define themselves by the man that they're with. And our women the traditional women have not bought into that, and the men have been tried. They've withstood enormous pressure to mistreat women or to see women as sort of possessions or something like that, and a lot of our men have had to withstand that. So I think it's important to raise your boys with that perspective, and for them to understand that being a warrior is not just about protecting the people, it's about taking care of the people and loving the people. And I think if we keep doing that in our homes, no matter what's going on in television or violent video games or anything, that we'll still be okay. The people that I've found, and I've traveled all over the world, who have the greatest peace of mind are traditional tribal people who have a set of very good values that they live by, very strong spiritual life. And so if you can raise them within that context, they'll be okay.
Are you ready to finish, or do you want to go on?
We can go on for another 5 minutes.
Oh,
Okay. Okay.
He's ready. He's ready.
One of the things I get kind of discouraged with the education system of today is that when you they think of the Indians only during Thanksgiving or maybe Pioneer Day, or a lot of them, some of these Indians are willing to jump up and celebrate Columbus Day when, hey, I mean, that's not cool. What is your opinion of that?
I think that you just have to develop material and take it to the principal, or locate material. There's material available now that talks about the wonderful, incredible Thanksgiving message of some of the tribes, which is true Thanksgiving, not this silliness that's going on now, but where people thank, the natural world and have ceremony attached to that. That's available now. And Jake Swamp published a publication with that material, and so rather than just letting it go on, I would take that information to the teacher. And I found by and large teachers, if you give them curriculum, they'll use it. They just don't have it. They're operating with the material that they have, or you're not going to get them to get off Columbus, believe me. I mean, so you just have to add accurate material during that period of time. They'll let them go on and do their Columbus hero thing, and then show a different perspective. And but I think if you have the material and you're there and you're volunteer to help them teach it, most people I found are cooperative.
Okay, one comment that I have is, rather than people researching the Indian culture, the Anglo people should research their culture.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Because all cultures, I'm convinced that every culture on earth can be traced back sometime to a system where there were values that showed people how to live their life, live a good life, and that had very good spiritual values.
I'm an asshole, and my question is when you're Native American, there's two different worlds that you live in. For me,
right.
The white and the Native American. How were you able to incorporate it? Did you weave everything together, or did you set things aside? Just say, like, if you wanted to be a doctor, you had to do a surgery on someone, and so that's not good. I mean, just to be able to be successful and to do that, how were you able to incorporate all those traditionals and put them together?
I think that tradition and traditional lifeways has more to do with values than probably anything else. And so I think that if you learn a set of values like these boys that this woman was talking about, you can take them with you anywhere. And so that if you have those basic values, and it doesn't matter what you do, you can move in and out of those worlds, and very easily. One time recently, well, before that, when President Reagan was in office, the tribes elected me to represent them in a meeting with him. And so one night I was meeting with him, and then the next night I was at a ceremony at home. And part of my job there was to cook. And so you see what I'm saying? So it was a very different world. And then recently I went to a Le Cirque in New York, which is a very fancy restaurant in New York, on a Thursday night. And that Saturday I was on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation with a drum. And so, I'm used to going in and out of those worlds, but I'm who I am no matter where I am. I always treat people respectfully, always try to have a good mind, always acknowledge people. And the things that I was taught at home, I don't leave them there. And and that's one thing I don't understand about other religions, how they can, or other lifeways, how they can segment their life. In our world, there's no separation between the sacred and the secular. Everything in creation is sacred. But I don't get it, how you go to church and have all these good values, and then if you're a store owner, you rip off your customers all week long. I mean, it doesn't, you know, you'd get all confused. And so I think you could go, you could do anything if you have a core set of values that you take with you, no matter where you go.
You mentioned that the dominant culture seems to be losing its way, and that's pretty obvious on a number of levels. There also is a hunger in that culture for many of the values you've described. What is your feeling about the Native peoples sharing their values with the dominant culture?
I don't think that everybody has a different opinion, but my opinion is that those very same values are in your culture and your history, and that you can find them there, and that you don't that certainly there are things that you can learn from listening to and talking to Native American people. But one of the things that I don't want to get psychological here, but one of the things I think is that people have a longing for community. And I can't describe to you how wonderful it is to, no matter what the problems are in my community, and they're daunting, to be born into a community of people that I know are always there. They don't care whether I have wealth. They don't care what I look like. It's like the land, the relationship with the land. The land doesn't care about all those things. That community defines in part who I am. And what I think I see in the larger society is a longing for community, a longing for stories, a longing for, you know, some sense of a time where people helped one another, and that's in all cultures. It's in all. I'm convinced of that. Absolutely convinced of that. This guy back there had his head.
Okay. All right.
I made an assumption that you have traveled out of the country already, so I was going to ask you, traveling outside of this country, do people seem more affluent to Native American culture and history, or do they kind of base themselves on, base their knowledge on old stereotypical views? And I had a second question, what was your favorite power? What area is your favorite power?
First, if you've traveled outside the country, what is the view of people outside the country about Native American culture and Native American stereotypes? Is the first question.
Okay. It depends on the country. In Germany, for example, there was a very popular novelist who wrote books that had real fanciful notions about Native Americans. And so they have people who adopt tribes, and they dress in that tribe's historic regalia and have encampments and that sort of thing. They're very strange. And so anyway, so but it's a great market for Native American artists. They sell lots of art there. And then in Britain, because they had some dignitaries visit early on, there's a little more of an accurate perspective. It just depends. It just depends.
And could I ask your second question, please?
What was your favorite power?
What was your favorite? Powwow.
My favorite powwow. Probably an honoring powwow that the Oklahoma tribes had for me when I was first elected. And it was spontaneous, and it was like a community powwow, and they all, cooked, and people from the different tribes came and brought gifts and that sort of thing. So
just about ready to finish.
I'm about ready to call it a night.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.